hi everybody. Welcome back to Spaces of Exchange, generously hosted by ICFAC. I'm Jacqueline Kok. I'm the curator and creator of this program. Just a little FYI about the program. Space of Exchange started as a desire to connect Chinese creatives based in different geographic regions and places to discuss and unpack the broader systemic issues that affect them and their communities. It was born from an urgency to push against the echo chambers that we become so easily trapped in, and the need to create moments and conversations to allow for a deeper understanding and deeper learning. So today for this session, we're going to be talking about painting as a reflection of current realities within and beyond the international Chinese community. With us, we have artists Misato Pang and Susan Chen. Together, we will explore how both artists channel their environment and their surroundings, and how these constellation of physical and situational circumstances inform their artistic practice as a whole. So, as usual, here's a gentle reminder of the format of the session for those who are tuning in for the first time. We're going to start off with a 20 to 30 minute conversation between myself and the artists before moving on into a 20 to 30 minute public Q&A. So feel free to post any questions that might arise in our initial conversation directly into the chat box. So now to briefly introduce my lovely guests. Misato Pang is a half Japanese, half Chinese artist born and raised in Hong Kong. She immigrated to the US in her late adolescent years. She draws on the intense concentration of saturated colors and abstracted forms in Fauvism, as well as the crudeness and somewhat sinister innocence of outsider art to create narratives that exist on the cusp of reality and imagination, belonging and displacement, diaspora and motherland. Susan Chen shuffled between an all-girls UK boarding school and an apartment in Hong Kong in her formative years. She's deeply invested in the interior-exterior landscape juxtaposition as a metaphor to convey themes of dissonance, duality, a search for belonging, and millennial anxieties that are framed by the digital world. She recently closed her first solo exhibition on longing that was held at the Meredith Rosen Gallery, and she's currently based in New York City. So jumping right in, I want to start our discussion with one big question. So Misato, your series, and Susan, your most recent paintings, both of your works are at once documentary in nature, and yet they have an incredibly intimate approach. I'm really compelled by, the flatness, but also the boldness of the colors that you guys choose and use in your works. And though you guys have two very distinct styles, Misato, I would say that, in a very general way of describing it, your works err more towards abstraction. And, Misato, your works err towards abstraction, and Susan, yours towards more figurative kind of depictions. You both engage and play with perception and depth, as well as color as a vehicle to communicate kind of intense emotions. Misato, if you want to go first, I want to ask about, this artistic choice. If you can speak about your artistic influences as well as your social influences, and maybe to describe a little bit of the surroundings and your circumstances that have led you to create your body of work. And I will be sharing screen for
awesome.
Your website. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. So a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Hong Kong until I was 17, and I moved to the United States. I was not a painter before that. And so my exposure to painting has a lot to do with the Western aesthetics. And so what you see on the screen right now is my website, and Jacqueline's going to click into this show called What Made Me, which was my thesis show for my master's graduation in New York Studio School. A lot of my works were influenced later by cultural events that I was part of, but never really fully was immersed, partially due to my bicultural upbringing. So I kind of felt like I'm always an outsider to some extent. So I wanted to recreate those moments by kind of inserting this imaginative quality and the way that I experience visual information, which is largely informed by a lot of Western painters. A lot of them are like, German expressionists like Max Beckmann. Matisse was great. just a lot of painters that I was kind of brought up with when I moved to New York. So I think it's kind of an interesting thing to recreate those narratives under Western aesthetics influence. So just trying to understand my place, being kind of like a global person in some way. What does it mean to be part of something yet you're kind of detached from it? So yeah, I would say a lot of my influences come from just studying art in the US. But a lot of those experience kind of brings me back to how I understand my past or my history as, you know, a Japanese Chinese person growing up in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong itself has some sort of identity, like a kind of like a bicultural identity, being like partially British and partially, you know, China. And so there's like so many layers of that context to play with. And so, yeah, I would say briefly, that's kind of what I'm going after. And I'm really drawn to outsider art just because of it's just simple to me. Like, it's really simple to understand, and I really enjoy that quality. So yeah, that's just a very short summary of.
Sure. And so I just kind of want to touch on the Where is Home series. If I understand correctly, this was all done in 2019, 2020. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so obviously 2019, for many who might not be totally aware, it was a very tumultuous time in Hong Kong. And in fact, now, you know, with the virus and the pandemic, it's, you know, it's just an added layer of this kind of extreme, you know, I almost want to use the word violence that's kind of happening, this kind of trauma that's happening within the, you know, the region. And so I just kind of want to know, you know, how that kind of influence, how that social circumstance influenced this body of work, and if in fact this body of work is specifically talking about what was happening, because I'm assuming you were also in Hong Kong when you made this body of work.
Actually, I wasn't in Hong Kong.
Oh, you weren't? Okay.
I wasn't. I never really made it back home because I was working 3 jobs in New York. So
wow.
I think a lot of those works were really fueled by a wide source of information, like videos, real life stories, like audio notes from my friends who were under extreme circumstances of violence, just documentaries, like articles, just news, and even like within my own household, like my dad and I would just have this really heated argument. And a lot of those things kind of shaped my experience of the whole, you know, political discourse. So it feels like I was there, but I wasn't. It's just, I think painting was my way of participating in that, because I knew I was so far removed from it physically that I needed to create my own journal, like my visual diary of the experience. But yeah, definitely. What was your other question? Sorry, I just kind of.
No, that was, I mean, that was pretty, what I was asking was basically, you know, whether the social circumstances kind of played an influence or played a huge part in this body of work. And it's kind of like a yes and no answer. It was like, yes, it did, but then also you were removed from it. So a lot of it was from, you know, out like removed context, which I actually think is a beautiful transition, if you don't mind, to Susan's work, who, you know, and I'm just going to finish sharing kind of the last few of your works. I find them so beautiful. But I am going to transition over to Susan. So Susan, I know that, you know, your, if I understand correctly, your body of work is also very much influenced and inspired by SubtleAsian Traits, which is this massive growing online community on Facebook. It started off as, I believe, if I, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, it started off as like a group of Australian Chinese, you know, Facebook users who wanted to create a sense of community, and then it just exploded. And it, you know, it became this like international, you know, platform for people who identify as Asians, you know, Southeast Asian, you know, Eastern Asian, and I believe even middle of Asia, so including Middle Eastern people, and it's like a place for them to express and to talk about. And I, if I understand correctly, your work is very much influenced by that, as well as, of course, other kind of circumstances while you were in New York. So I don't know if you want to kind of jump in and answer that question as well, which is, can you talk about your artistic influences and your social influences, and also the social circumstances that have helped you and led you to create this body?
Sure. If you go to, there's a slide, maybe not, I want to say, you keep going. There's like a slide where there's like a lot of pictures of sitters.
Okay. Sorry, I don't know what happened here with the.
No worries at all. Maybe I want to say like, actually, maybe I can tell you which slide it is. Oh, slide like, sorry, like 25.
Got it. Okay. There we go.
But yeah, so no, what happened was I got, like, my sister actually added me onto SubtleAsian Traits, and I became like really fascinated by this group because I realized, like, it's not like a group with 1,000 people, but there's like over 1 million people on it. So it's kind of like this sort of social phenomenon. And so I spent a lot of time like browsing, like just like what was being posted on there. And I felt like what I was noticing was, yes, people would talk a lot about like sort of the social or like the psychological, issues that are relate to being either like Asian living in a Western country, like in Europe, or in the States, or, it started in Australia. And also like intergenerational conflicts between our millennial generation and their parents. But I thought for me, like with everything that was being posted, in the end, it sort of came down to this question of like, am I worthy? Like, like in a, just like in the Western world where you don't see a lot of like Asian faces in media advertisements where they're depicting people who are supposedly ideal. And I just felt like a lot of the posts like were related to this like question of worthiness. And so I started looking for essentially like people off like different Asian American social media groups to come into the studio to be like my sitters. And yeah, most of these sitters are like not professional sitters. So they don't really, they're not trained to sit there for long hours. So what usually happens is people end up like talking throughout the whole time, and feels like this juggle between like being a therapist and painting. But no, it's been really cool to me, like people from all different walks of life.
But that's really interesting that you kind of use the word therapy, because Misato, it's almost like you kind of referred to that a little bit. It was like implied that your access into what felt so removed. And actually, I think that's kind of the beautiful thing about both your works, is that there is this kind of red thread, this common thread of distance, right? Of feeling never belonging in one specific category, in one specific place. And in some way, shape, or form, whether it's Susan with you directly speaking to the sitter, or Misato with you translating, what you're hearing and what you're, seeing in terms of like news into a painting format, into, your expression, that is a kind of like a therapeutic, cathartic kind of experience, which I almost find like really beautiful. And so that leads me almost to my next question, which is, is this experience some sort of, and I'm just going to exit from this share screen, is this experience in some way, a kind of reconciliation, a kind of healing? Do you guys feel that when you guys are making the work, like, is it a space in which you can confront, unpack, unravel these kind of torn experiences, especially being raised biculturally, especially being exposed to two different kind of situations, because you guys both have that, the kind of East Asian versus Western kind of dialogue. So is painting almost like this place where you can kind of reconnect and reconcile a lot of these differences that you feel?
Definitely. I would say so. And I think painting painting is a way of creating a mobile experience wherever you are, with subjects that it could be as far removed as like from yourself physically or emotionally, mentally, but painting is a way of finding your way back to that thing that you care about, I think. And it's a way to make it more palpable and maybe even digestible, because it's like, how do you even convey emotions? You know, like words sometimes fall short, and I feel like images and like, for me, colors hold great emotional qualities, and using really intense saturated colors, I think it is in a way of conveying something that is as intense as like, you know, this extreme disappointment or like extreme hurt that I experienced during, and trauma during that whole year, where there's nothing I could do about it other than to create images. And that is the best I could do, because in a way it's preparing myself to accept the reality for what it is, but never compromising on the fact that this is actually not okay. Like it's in a way of fighting for that reality to be changed through the act of painting. And I think that is actually really powerful. And it's refusing to succumb to the defeated stance of what that political oppression or even like discourse looks like. So that's my way of kind of seeing painting as healing. Yeah.
Susan, did you want to jump in on that about painting as kind of a site for reconciliation and healing?
Yeah, I feel like for me, painting is most interesting when you're using it to learn about something you either don't know about yourself or you don't quite have answers yet for. I definitely think like painting sitters, and you know, just after like 10 or 15 sitters, you realize there's like a common thread of sort of what, you know, like there is a lot of like people who share stories about like microaggressions they experience like in their daily lives, and then you realize it's actually a thing that is bigger than yourself. And I think for a lot of sitters too, they don't realize that actually they're in this like giant community and everyone is going through the same thing but not able to put terms to it yet. I feel like painting is very much like a diary, and you're spending such long hours in the studio. It's probably more relatable now to a lot of people during the pandemic, when you spend so much time like reflecting on your relationships. But I think, you know, when you're painting for long hours, there is a lot of like self-reflection that even if you don't want to admit is happening. And so in that sense, like all of it sort of together does, I'm sure, like somehow forms a kind of therapy for like yourself or others.
So I want to open this up to the public Q&A, but while we're waiting for questions from the public, maybe I can squeeze in one more question. And it has to do very much with the pandemic. And I know it kind of is a widely discussed topic about the kind of limits of the pandemic. But, you know, I'm really interested in kind of the physical engagement between visitors or viewers with the actual work of art. And I feel that painting specifically requires that engagement. You know, art critic and art historian Isabel Gra spoke extensively about kind of painting's continued success, even despite this, you know, boom of like, you know, this digital era boom. And so I kind of wonder, in a way, you know, how are you guys both coping with this sudden change of not being able to see as many artworks, or, you know, how are you guys coping with the idea of like, you know, viewers or participants aren't able to go to galleries and see your work? I know that there are many ways around it, and I know, Misato, you had published a book recently with poetry in it, I believe, which I think is like a beautiful alternative. But I wonder, is that kind of an ideal that you've put out there, or is it just another avenue, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, well, first of all, like COVID is such an unexpected time, right? It's nobody was prepared for it. And part of me, I know that this won't last forever. I mean, who knows how long, but because I know it won't last forever, I actually felt like it's such an opportunity for us to explore different creative ways of presenting the same thing. And painting is tricky, right? Because painting in person, like in flesh versus on digital platforms are very different.
Mhm.
So I felt like I needed to adjust my paintings according to the way that it's presented, which is why I completely switched over to painting on paper and using materials that I would never used, like such as watercolor, some more of like ink and crayons or colored pencils, because they're more easily like replicated. Like it's easier to kind of present them on digital platforms, and combining with poetry and publishing a book, it's all kind of done as the strategy to engage audience. Because nobody wants to buy a painting these days, especially when I moved to Hong Kong. The market is just very different. So I kind of have to adjust the way that I present my paintings for people to want to engage with it. And that's kind of one of the ways that I decided to kind of try out as a project. So there's a lot of experiment behind, like, how do I want to curate my paintings? How do I want to combine this experience of reading and looking to make people interested in art, and hopefully they would actually want to take one step further and say, hey, I want to actually look at your real paintings because now I feel familiar. So creating and cultivating a familiarity with your own work, you know, it's a form of art, I think, but it takes time to cultivate. And I think COVID really gave us that opportunity, if we look at it in a more positive light. But yeah, I also know a lot of galleries that have been doing really well with the virtual viewing. So yeah.
And Susan, do you want to talk a little bit about your opening and how COVID may or may not have affected that kind of presentation?
Yeah, I think definitely there's no opening because it would be like a gathering, and the gallery hours got cut shorter, in the sense it was like, instead of like running for the full week, it would run like Thursday to Sunday. But but yeah, visitors would have to either like make an appointment or sign in or that kind of thing. But yeah, I think one of the biggest frustrations for me for sure is painting. I mean, like we see a lot of work now on Instagram seems to be like the way that a lot of artists connect with one another to keep viewing work, and it kind of has just been exacerbated because of COVID. There's something very like frustrating about you know, seeing like painting on a small screen versus in real life are completely different experiences, and it flattens out something that is so human. That being said, it's better than the platform not existing and everyone sort of like completely disconnecting.
Right.
But I wonder how that will change like a whole generation of like collectors who like the way that they visualize and understand art. And yeah, in terms of like how COVID has affected the studio, you know, I can't work with sitters in person anymore. So I only just recently started painting people from Zoom.
Right.
And yeah, I thought it would be like way horrifying than I expected. Definitely there have been like technical glitches.
Right.
But the cool thing now is you can paint someone from like anywhere in the world, versus just someone locally. The weird thing is like going, you know, meeting someone for the first time on the computer, and then like 3 hours later, you're like, usually when it's like a sitter who's like local, like you can be like, oh, we can get coffee in a few weeks or that kind of thing. With like this kid I painted in Georgia the other day, I was like, see you, I don't know, like never, like maybe in 2022. I'm like, when will I be in Georgia next? I'm not sure.
Right.
So yeah, but I wonder, it must be similar to how people who go on like or going on like Zoom dates or Tinder dates, that kind of thing.
Great. Well, I don't know if anyone has any questions that they want to ask our artists. We're, you know, waiting here, but you know, if while we're waiting, I guess I could also ask Misato, what are you doing now in your studio? I know Susan talked about, you know, painting via Zoom. Misato, I'm, you know, are you having that experience as well, that kind of transitioning online?
Yeah, as of now, I'm not really painting. I'm looking at a lot of paintings because I think I kind of got really not burnt out, but I was kind of like on the edge of that when I was just like kind of spitting out a bunch of works. So I'm taking a step back and really looking over all the works that I've made in the past half year, you know, from Hong Kong, and just understanding like, what am I interested in, and what are the habits, and what is this like rock that I'm building my images upon. So I'm trying to understand that before I paint again. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at, just like taking a step back and just resting a little bit and absorbing images. And I'm in St. Louis right now, and there are museums that I could actually go see works.
Right.
So I've been feeling really great about that, because I have not seen paintings in like forever, and it's been really good. Yeah.
It's insane how art is really nourishing. And, you know, during the COVID, I'm based in Toronto. So during the COVID period, everything was closed. You know, we weren't allowed to go to galleries. We weren't allowed to go to museums. And, you know, to be honest, I was really scared to go, obviously, because of, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of different values and approaches towards, you know, this kind of pandemic that we obviously see, obviously in the States and elsewhere. But it just became a thing where when I finally got to go see art, I was on like a bender. I was going like, you know, like full days every day, you know, like tire myself out. But it was so nourishing to be in front of something that is, I mean, innately human, right? The act of creating. So I definitely relate to that. And again, we're still waiting for questions. So, you know, guys, if you want to leave in the chat box, but otherwise I can keep going. I'm totally happy with it. But yeah, so I guess while, you know, again, while we're waiting, I do want to bring up the idea of Instagram and showing your work on Instagram. Susan, you touched upon that. And awesome, I have a question, but I'll ask my question first since I'm like halfway through. So, you know, the idea of showing your work on Instagram is such a tricky thing, not just because of the quality, not just because of what you're seeing and the, you know, the image being smaller, but also the idea of like copyright. And I don't want to get into, you know, legal terms, right? But it is this idea of like, now everyone can see it, you know, and granted it's your choice, you know, like it's your account, it's your access, but it's this idea of like, everyone has access to it. Everyone can share that image, that reproduction of that work, on a truly, you know, international scale that can be so fast. And I just wonder, you know, I always ask myself, like, what are the pros and cons of the situation? You know what I mean? Like what, like, in a way it's like, awesome, we're getting art out there. Granted, it's not the you know, the ideal format of it, but we're sharing it. But then at the same time, I'm like, but how are the artists being protected in this kind of situation? So I wonder how you guys feel about that and Instagram and the world of social media and how it affects your creative process, or how you guys look at it, I guess. Susan or Misato, whichever one, you know, take it away.
I feel like, I feel like for me, wait, sorry, I like lost my train of thought for a second. Oh, Instagram. Yes. I think it definitely speeds up this idea of production, because, you know, I think artists at, you know, before the internet really had time, especially for young artists, you have time to grow your work. I think a lot of young artists now, like, it's very easy to become an influencer if you wanted to. And also, once you are getting like essentially like approval through likes, it becomes very easy to keep making the same thing because you're like, this is what people like. So I think in that sense, it feels a little dangerous. In terms of like work being shared, I think it comes down to like personal, like not like values, maybe values actually, but for me, like if someone shares it's kind of like with musicians, like if someone like sells, like keeps like sharing your songs illegally, like some artists are like very upset about that, whereas other artists, like, you know, find it very flattering and they don't care. So I think I would lean on the side of like, in my eyes, like once the painting leaves the studio, it's completely out of your control. And, you know, whatever happens to it, that like goes into its own world. But yeah, I guess it doesn't matter to me if someone like prints off my painting and puts it on a t-shirt and sells it. I'm like, you do you, yo.
Yeah, I think it's kind of difficult to comment on the ownership of art, because like once you take it to a platform such as Instagram, you really don't own your paintings to a
Right.
large extent. You don't own that image anymore. Like same thing with Google search, right? Like you search your image, you find yourself like all over the web page. It's like the internet is way more complex than we think. So it's difficult, and I think it's inevitable, being the age and time here now, like, you know, especially with COVID. What COVID did was kind of like amplified the magnitude of what the internet could do, but also speeds up everything that went virtual. So I don't really have a problem with sharing my things, partially maybe because I don't think anyone would ever do anything with my paintings. But I do agree with the whole like influencer culture. Like there's such a huge part of branding culture within even the art community on Instagram. I think you could use it to your advantage, but it requires great discipline, because you could like anyone could be easily content with posting an image and getting likes, right? But I think it comes down to you as an artist. Like, how do you control that outlet, and how do you not let that dictate your practice and your search? Because that would be a great cost, right? Like you're just so focused on making it in the digital realm that your paintings are coming kind of like it's coming at the expense of your images and your paintings.
Right.
So I find myself kind of in between those spaces, and I try to distance myself whenever I can. Because when I hit a wall, I know I'm just posting images because I need to prove somehow that I'm making works. So I haven't been posting a whole lot because I realized that I'm starting to do that. So I pulled back. But yeah, ownership is a difficult thing to comment on, I think. Yeah.
And definitely that sense of validation and the idea of online care too. I think, you know, a lot of us tune into social media world, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram, or whatever platform you choose. There is this underlying or undercurrent of like connection that we're trying to maintain. And for some reason, and I, you know, maybe I'm kind of, I shouldn't be speaking for everybody and more for myself, but I do feel like in the sense when I'm on, you know, for example, Twitter, right? And like I go through the people's comments, but it's also like you're trying to almost filter the ones that you connect to or relate to a little bit harder and stronger. And I think that that's such a tricky gray area to navigate. Like at what point are you saying to yourself, like, yes, what you see online is totally not definitive and, you know, representative of who you are, but then you all like, you know, it's like, then you're still seeking for it somehow in some place. So yeah, I definitely think ownership, online care, these are all really hard topics and complex topics to navigate, especially when you throw in, you know, art and you throw in, you know, human connection and humanity into it. Yeah. But we do have a question from one of our audience members. So Whitson Ramsey asks, I know in my own work during COVID, I have found myself looking at less and less paintings for my influences and more so being inspired by other aspects of life. Do either of you have outside influences from other art forms like or music, etc.?
Silence.
I mean, like, so
I feel like for me, it's like you start to notice, because I don't know, I'm like very much like trapped at home, sort of like living my best domestic life ever right now. So like you start to notice the mundane sort of things become, I don't know, I feel like I spend a little like more of moments being like, oh, like I didn't realize, you know, that soap, like I always use that brand of soap or kind of thing. So in terms of influences, like daily life, sort of like focusing like things you didn't used to care about, like it, like sitting around in the domestic space, even like going to the supermarket, those things become like hyper, I don't know, you're like more sensitive to it, I think. And then also just like the news, like every time you turn it on, you're like, the world is hell again today. And I'm sure that will, like, the anxiety from that definitely will seep into the work somehow.
Yeah, I agree. I think like the thing about like COVID is like it forces you to slow down, right? And I think like during COVID, I agree with Whitson. Like I didn't really look at a whole lot of work I actually was kind of drawing upon my own well of emotions to create a lot of images. That's why it went incredibly abstract, because for a long time I painted representationally, and that felt like it falls short of what I was trying to say or what I was trying to kind of get to. So for me, it's kind of like carving out those spaces and finding that particular feeling within the images that I was creating. And the thing about like information or anything that happens to us is never stagnant. So I think there was an accumulated foundation of things that I could really draw from within myself. So it involved more of the process of introspection during COVID. Now it's getting a little better, because I feel like you just need to I felt like I needed to deplete that source before I move on to absorb more information.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I navigated the last 6 months, just creating a lot of images and a sense of like playfulness. I was playing a lot because I can't make another serious painting during a very serious time when the whole world is like falling apart. So that's kind of where I found myself and positioned myself. Yeah.
Do you guys, or like, are you guys listening to an artist or a musician or reading, someone's writing that has rung true for you guys during this time?
Yeah. It sounds really depressing, but I asked for a list of novels from my sister, who's a writer, and she just gave me a list of novels that were kind of surrounding like human existence and what it means to be alone in this world, because I was feeling incredibly alone, and I wanted to explore that particular concept within paintings, like as in a formal, kind of like a formal thing. Like, how do I convey that concept of like aloneness in the world through objects in space, or how do I compose my image so that you could feel that sense of isolation and solitude? And so I definitely drew upon certain inspirations from books, from this Japanese writer who actually tried to commit suicide like many, many times. And that story was just, it felt mundane, but it conveys this emotion that you can't just easily articulate. And so he's able to layer that sentiment through stories. And so I wanted to do the same with my images. So that's kind of the source I went to a lot. Yeah.
That's actually, it's really, well, it's interesting. Well, you were talking about like loneliness, and I think it's such a universal feeling right now.
Right.
And it like, so that, the song Super Lonely, I think it was like #1 for like a while. And I just remembered like I made a whole painting like based of that song that was like on repeat a lot. And in my mind, I was like, that's definitely a purple painting.
Wow. That's really cool. I want to see it. I mean, it sounds amazing.
Oh yeah, I don't have it in this room, but.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's funny that we talk about, the universal emotion of like feeling alone, feeling trapped, feeling lonely during this kind of like really intense and like unpredictable time. But I wonder, have you guys had moments of connectivity? Because online with Zoom, it's like that's obviously taken a life of its own. That's become like this massive entry point to reconnecting with people. So have you felt that reconnection come back to life in your own lives?
Yes.
I feel like for me, maybe like prioritizing, I think I definitely got like closer with family members during this time, because I think back like before COVID, everyone's always like busy at work. It was always just like text messages, and like now you actually, I don't know, like now you have time. You don't really have an excuse because you're just like at home all the time. So it's been really nice to like connect with like family members through like Zoom.
Yeah, I know we're talking a little bit about like the whole social media and everybody going virtual. And I think that's another form of opportunities that I experienced during this time, is that everybody's now online. Like I think most people have been in quarantine or willingly quarantine themselves due to like safety reasons.
Yeah.
But I sense this like community that I've never had before, because everybody's ready to connect. And we've never been more on the same page than before, because we all know that this is a serious issue, and everybody experiences loneliness, and everybody is willing to kind of be open to more communities online. So I started doing a lot of virtual art talks and studio visits with tons of artists all over the world. And it had been one of the most rewarding experiences enabled by COVID, because I don't think I would have done it.
Yeah.
Compared to the time I was in New York. I was working so much and I had no time for people. So I feel like the connectivity takes on a different form, because it comes from an innate need to connect, and that has been limiting from the COVID. And so it pushed people, and myself included, to the other extreme of like, let's just connect all the time. Like, let's just kind of make up for this lack of in-person meeting by just meeting tons of people. So
yeah, I have noticed the cool thing about like since March is that there are a lot of like maybe like really famous artists that you usually wouldn't be able to like see their studio or like even like have coffee with them, and suddenly they have like, if you just Google, you know, you'll probably be able to find like a Zoom conversation they had recently or that they're going to have. So in that sense, it's been cool to like you know, like sort of like meet artists that you usually wouldn't have. So I guess in that sense, it makes things more democratic, more accessible.
Right.
And so Susan, how has like, you know, because we kind of shifted from loneliness and being alone to like, hey, you know, there is this like rejuvenation almost of like desire for connecting. And I wonder how that's translated for you in your work, because you're still painting sitters, though they're on Zoom. So like, and at one point you did mention, you're like, hey, you know, it's not the same anymore because I can't invite them to coffee or I can't schedule to see them again. So there are obviously limits to this connection that's being built. And so I wonder, how does that translate artistically for you in your like exploration of displacement, in your exploration of, you know, all the things that we talked about, never feeling like belonging to one place or one culture? How is that kind of translated?
Yeah, I can't tell you yet because I'm sort of like in the early stages. But they're definitely like in terms of, you know, I'm trying to paint like at least 20 people over Zoom, over different size canvases, hopefully having them all on a wall. And the way I thought about connecting all of them would be to have like this large mirror like across it all. So it's like some form of reflection. And I think all these sitters are sort of like all over, I mean, in different parts of the States. And I don't know, I'm like, after the Spanish flu came the roaring 20s. So, you know, hopefully like everyone eventually, it'll be really cool to be able to like, for all my sitters to like meet one another, because it's not like people are really doing this for money because you don't get paid a lot. And so people are doing it more for like the mission, which has to do with like visibility and PanAsian Unity.
Cool.
And Misato, and for you, have you, I mean, just kind of going off on PanAsian Unity, how has that translated or affected you in the way that you think or create or are thinking now while you're absorbing, you know, this new set of knowledge that you've kind of taken on post moving back, or I guess, you know, being in the States?
Can you define PanAsian Unity actually?
So
like,
I would describe it, I mean, it's really tricky, right? Like, how do you, because I don't think that there should be ever one universal way of describing Asianness. But I think it's this moment of solidarity amongst all Asians, which is really, again, still really tricky. Like even that's a poor definition in my opinion. So I don't know, Susan, if you want to jump in, but for me, it is this idea of like, you know what, we need to accept our differences, and we are accepting our differences, and that's part of the unity, at least for me, while also celebrating the differences. So it's not just an acceptance, an acknowledgement. It is a celebration of all the various kinds of definitions of Asianness that comes out. So that's my take on it. But Susan, I don't know if you have a different take on PanAsian Unity.
Yeah, I feel like for me, PanAsian Unity is so like I think about even just like the generation above, like parents' generation, and how sensitive and complicated like Asian history is when it comes to like relationships with one another. Like thinking about like Japan and China and the wars and Korea, and even like British colonialism and how like it affected like India and trade and that kind of thing. And so I feel like with our generation compared to the generation above, we're just so much more accepting, maybe because we didn't know like experience like the aftermath and traumas of war as closely as like our parents did. And I think that's also what subtle Asian traits is. It's like this place where people are setting aside, you know, those sort of like historical like issues, and being like, okay, well, you're Japanese and you're Korean, but really like we are sort of, I don't know, I feel like with subtle Asian traits interesting because it's kind of like people are bonding over like essentially like being displaced. So it's like, what do we have in common?
Right.
We're all displaced on the other side of the world.
Right.
But they always say like with colleagues, the ones who suffer together are the ones who bond the most. There's something about suffering together that really brings people together.
Right.
And so, yeah, I guess in my mind, PanAsian Unity is this, it's just like people are more accepting of one another and wanting to, like the solidarity part that you're talking about.
Misato, does that kind of ring in your, not necessarily in your work, but in the way in which you process information, or in the ways in which you, like that, is that something that you tap into when you're creating, or is it something that you negate? Like, are you thinking about this? Because I know, especially with Hong Kong, and especially with, you know, again, the different histories between Japan and Hong Kong, like that is very intricate. It's very complex, it's very layered. And what's funny is that the pandemic has, you know, in some way, shape, or form, and same with SubtleAsian Traits, it's created this opportunity, at least, to say, let's connect, right? And, you know, for better or for worse, I'm not entirely too sure. Like, I can't really define or, you know, even begin to try to like unpack that, or if I did, it'd be like another like 4-hour Zoom call. But yeah, so I wonder for you, like, is that something that you're thinking about when you're creating, and when you're thinking about unity, or is that something that kind of stands true in your thought process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think instead of unity, I was thinking more of creating allies. So for me, it's not, I guess I kind of took it for granted that Asians just stand together, but obviously that's not the case. Because even within Hong Kong, for example, like the generational gap and political stance differences, that's everywhere. Like we are always going to be a little divided, unfortunately. But I think what's more of a interest and concern and almost passion for me is to create allies through platforms such as painting, to open up spaces for some sort of dialogue, which is why I never paint images that are overly explicit. I want it to be personal. I want it to be something that I feel, and nobody should invalidate another person for feeling the things they feel.
Absolutely.
So I think for me, I've gotten really great success in kind of inviting people into that space because it's a personal space. So in a way, it's creating allies with people that are outside of like Asian race, like for example, like, you know, African American communities, or even like, you know, just people from like all walks of life. And I believe that that's actually more powerful than to just trying to hold up a group of people that share the same ethnic background over something that has so many layers, like so many different nuances within that. And hopefully that create a more productive force in changing systems. And it takes a long time, but I think like being educated and being informed is the first step. And if we just do that within the Asian community, I feel like it's great, but I'm hoping to kind of make that a more inviting space and dialogue for other people to understand what it's like to be different kinds of Asians even, and what does it mean to face this like conflict. You know, being Chinese and Japanese had been one of the most difficult experiences in my childhood because I couldn't reconcile this dichotomy of like values and histories. So that's kind of where I stand in terms of like unity. It's about creating allies and partnership. Yeah.
Well, that's a really beautiful way to kind of wrap it up. And I just kind of wanted to slip in. No, it really is. I wanted to slip in this kind of And I know it sounds really like idealistic and, you know, maybe even far too utopian, but in some way, you know, that's kind of the power of art, right? Like instead of siloing it into this kind of like identity label where it's like, you know, you are a X, Y, and Z person, and that's how, like, that's informed you know what I mean? And like, there's a way in which art can kind of escape that boundary, escape that kind of category of, say, this was done by a, you know, a Chinese person, or even an international Chinese person, or it could be, you know, an African person, or, you know, the fact that it can escape that, and it can talk about something that is so far more like crucial in terms of an experience or an emotion that is shareable and that is widely kind of accessible, is almost what I feel, for me at least, is what's drawn me to art, right? I mean, I know it sounds really weird because art history is so complex in its history, but, you know, powerful works of art are able to kind of escape all of that kind of in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not completely, but it has allowed to say, hey, it doesn't matter where you come from, the act of creating and creativity in itself is a human thing. And there's something really beautiful about that, without, of course, negating the history. You know what I mean? It is still, we are still in that process of talking about it, unpacking many different layers. But to say, you know what, like, this is kind of the thing that rings true for everybody, I think is really beautiful. Talking about allyship is actually exactly what this program is about, especially, you know, exactly what, you know, kind of the aim of what I've been trying to do, or, you know, my work as a curator. So it's a really beautiful way to kind of end this this talk. But I don't know, Susan, if you have any kind of last final things that you want to throw in.
No, I thought this was a great like Friday morning conversation.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for joining me, and for everybody for joining us on this Friday morning. Of course, this talk will be recorded. It will be shared on YouTube. So feel free to, you know, watch. And if you guys have any questions, I'm sure, you know, ICFAC is always here to kind of send in your, to take in your questions and to take in your ideas. Well, thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much. It's been fun. Thanks, everyone.
Lovely speaking to you guys. Bye.
Bye, guys. Bye.